Greetings, students, and welcome to this edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. Now, in today's edition, we're going to be studying some Chinese history. Specifically, we're going to look at the Qin Dynasty and the Han Dynasty. But our story begins with the Qin Dynasty, which was ruled by the great Qin Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. Now, the Qin had a relatively short dynastic cycle. And you should know that a dynastic cycle is the cycle that every dynasty goes through where it comes to power, rules for a while, and then eventually falls apart. Now, we said that the Qin had a relatively short dynastic cycle. And what I mean by that is they ruled China for a relatively short period of time. But even in that short period of time, they are going to have a lasting and profound impact on Chinese history. For example, the Qin Emperor instituted a policy known as legalism. Legalism was the official ideology of the Qin Dynasty, and it was based on the belief that all the citizens in the empire were evil. Now, if you're a government and you believe that all your citizens are evil, in order to run effectively, you need a system of strict laws and harsh punishments. Punishments that are so harsh, in fact, that no one would dare to commit a crime. Now, a system like this certainly would reduce the crime rate, but it's also not going to be particularly popular among the citizens. And that's not the only example of such a policy from the Qin Dynasty. The Qin were becoming concerned about the growing influence of Confucian scholars. So they would go on to conduct one of history's first book burnings, and they also executed many of these scholars by throwing them into a pit. And even some of the great building works of the Qin were conducted in a similar manner. Thousands of people were forced to work against their will on the Great Wall of China. Construction of the Great Wall of China began during the time of the Qin Dynasty, as well as work on the tomb of the Qin Emperor himself. Now, the Qin Emperor decided that he wanted to have one of the most opulent tombs in history. He wanted to bring his army with him to the afterlife, and so he ordered life-size copies made of all the soldiers in his army. Now, this project was never finished by the time that the Qin Dynasty came to the end of its dynastic cycle. However, literally thousands of these soldiers are buried near the Chinese city of Xi'an. Now, the Qin obviously are going to leave their mark on Chinese history, but because they were unpopular, they were soon overthrown and replaced by the Han Dynasty. Now, the Han were smart enough to realize the situation in which they had found themselves. Certainly, many policies of the Qin were very unpopular, and so the Han would come in and make sweeping changes, but the Han also realized that the Qin had been very successful. And so they realized that they would be very wise to retain some of the policies from the Qin Dynasty as well. Let's look at some of the policies that the Han are going to change, as well as some of the things that they are going to keep in place. Our first example is that the Han are going to get rid of legalism. Remember, legalism was the policy that was based on harsh punishments in order to prevent crime. The Han are going to get rid of legalism, and they're going to go back to the teachings of Confucius. Confucius was a scholar who lived during the time of the Zhou Dynasty and was focused on politics and relationships. When the Han go back to the teachings of Confucius, that lasting influence will be carried forward into future dynasties as well. The other thing that the Han are going to do is that they are going to consider the family to be the center of Chinese society. They go back to a concept known as filial piety. Filial piety means that you subjugate your own desires, your own interests, to whatever is most important for the family. Now, that's going to be a change. During the time of the Qin Dynasty, it was the Qin Emperor who was considered to be the center of Chinese society. Now with the Han Dynasty, it's once again the family that is at the center of Chinese society. There are, though, some things that the Han are going to wisely keep from the Qin Dynasty. For example, the Han retained the Qin bureaucracy. The Qin had a robust bureaucracy in place that was capable of executing all of the day-to-day operations of even a very large empire like the Qin. The Han are going to keep many of those things in place when they take over and begin their own dynastic cycle. The other thing that the Han are going to do is keep the Qin meritocracy. Now, a meritocracy is a system of choosing officials based on who is the most qualified to do that job. That's a pretty novel idea, especially for the ancient world. But you may ask, well, how do you determine who's most qualified to do that job? Well, what happened was they would administer what's known as a civil service examination. A civil service examination is literally a written test that was given. And based on the results of that test, that would determine who was qualified to do a given job. So the Qin were very successful implementing civil service examinations and a meritocracy, and that is something else that the Han are going to keep in place when they are ruling China. So certainly the Han are going to leave their own impact on China. For example, Chinese inventions like printing and paper, as well as the compass and even a seismograph, which was a rudimentary earthquake detector, are going to propel China forward. The other thing that we see taking place during the Han Dynasty is the beginning of Silk Road trade. The Silk Road is going to connect China with Asia and even places as far away as Europe. Silk, along with other goods, were traded along this trade network. So the network would begin in the city of Xi'an in China, and then this trade network would stretch all the way to the Middle East, India, and Rome. Well, as we can see, the Qin certainly had a profound impact on China, but the Han in their own right are going to leave behind a legacy as well. And that's it for this edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. I hope that you have enjoyed it and keep studying the social studies.